There we go. All right, before we do anything else, because I won't say we're behind, but we're a little bit congested right now with respect to the schedule. One of the things I'd like to do is find out who wants to do the presentations for starting next week for this next module. Okay, we've got 3 readings that are assigned. Okay, none of them is prohibitively long or anything. They could probably be presented by one person. You know, it doesn't really matter all that much. If you want to double up, you can. Somebody asked me in another class, is it all right if someone wants to present on more than one thing, even if you don't get credit for it? That is, like in the modules where you present, you don't do a paper, but you've got to do a minimum number of papers, and you can refer to the syllabus for that. If you just want to present on something or help somebody present on something, that's fine. It's just that I'm only going to give you credit for 2 presentations, and the other part of the grade, it has to be satisfied by written material. So if you want to do that, it's up to you. But I don't know that it's necessary. But the problem when you have a class this small, and we have perennially a few people who just don't show up. You know, they look at the recording and they get the materials, but they don't show up. What they're going to do when it's time to present, I have no idea, nor do I particularly care. You kind of run out of bodies, you know. Normally when this class is taught, I might have like 20 people. Okay, obviously we don't have that here. So we've got these 3 articles we're going to do for next time around. And one of them is this U.S. grand strategy and the origins of the so-called development state. I thought that's a really good transition from our stuff on state theory. It also might be of interest to any of you who've done any studying in U.S. foreign policy or Cold War foreign policy or anything like that, because on the one hand, you know, we were trying to get into this discussion last time about how the concept of the state got kind of pushed aside in American social science. The argument is as a consequence of the Cold War. What the development state thesis argues is something a little different from that. Okay. So that might, is there anybody who has any particular interest in doing that U.S. grand strategy and the origins of the development state?
Yeah, I kind of want to do it now, but I did just present. But is that?
That's not a problem.
Okay.
You'll just have to write on the last 2 modules. Or, well, we've got to do one is writing, and then there's also an in-class. Everybody's going to do a presentation, which is going to count as a written assignment, because what you'll do is you'll write up a summary of that when we're done.
So you can
Sure, you could do that. I was kind of thinking, Kyle, that you might be interested in that.
Yeah, I think that sounds really cool. Like, yeah.
Okay. All right, so we got Kyle down for the development state. Theories of dependency and globalization. That might be better with 2 people, only because it's not the most brilliantly written thing. It's not very long, but it's a little bit conceptually dense. There are only, though, a few things that I want you to get out of that. One of them is the distinction between what's called classical development theory and dependency. If you get those things out of that article, that's enough to be going on with. As far as whether or not they fit into some stripe of globalization, I think that's almost more a rhetorical or conceptual argument than it is anything substantive for our purposes. Is there anybody who wants to do that?
I can do it.
Who was, okay, great. All right. Okay, and then we have one more. Subsistence perspective on development. This is an interesting one. It took me a long time to find a good sort of alternative development theory article. And this is an article that kind of rejects those assumptions of development as measured by economic growth and things like that. And it's trying to suggest that we've gotten, well, I don't want to give away the punchline though, do it. But anyway, there are these orthodox models of development. This purports to be a much more desirable alternative. It's somewhat normatively informed. There is, it's also informed somewhat by feminist theory and by different kinds of theories that aren't normally brought to bear in studies of political and economic development. So it's an interesting, well, I think it's an interesting read. Is anybody who might want to do that? Remember, all you're doing is capturing the essence of it. Emma, did you raise your hand?
Yeah, I could do it.
Okay, great. All right. Well, then we're all set. Now I don't have to worry about forgetting to do that. So we'll do those probably in order as they appear on the syllabus starting next week. We may get all three of them done in one class too, because as I say, neither one of them is incredibly complex. We only want to go for the core arguments there and then kind of fit those into a general discussion of development. Okay. I want to come back to this question of development, if we have time toward the end of this class. But what we were doing was we took the articles in a little bit out of sequence. We did the alternative theories book review article to get us started. Then we started on the relatively complex and sort of sprawling discussion of how the notion of the state got dropped disproportionately from American social sciences, right, and development studies, and how it found its way back in. And then we're going to finish with our discussion of Skocpol and this notion of bringing the state back in. So let's pick up then on why the state was dropped in the first place, if we could do that.
So last time we worked on this, you said you wanted us to focus on, because we covered the main 2 points.
That's right. Yeah.
Why the state was dropped, and you wanted us to cover what brought the state back in.
Yeah. Yeah.
And me and Shelby talked about it for a few hours, like about 2 hours, and we really couldn't find much except for a shift from the sense of like the groupthink of the pluralists to more of a national sense of romance, destiny, and like a need for shared challenges, that sort of thing.
And where do you find that in the actual article? What part of the article, for people who want to sort of play along at home, where would they look in Sibley's article to find that?
Page 206, the very bottom of the page.
Okay.
There's a little excerpt there that reads, "There's a hard, cold edge to Senator Phil Gramm, as there is to the entire Republican field. They talk tax rates, not virtues. They talk about efficiency, about giving people their money back, about returning government to local communities. That is important and attractive, but insufficient. America is bound by more than the sum of our self-interested strivings. There's a national sense of romance, of destiny, that is a need for shared challenges. A word that the president wore out last week. Ronald Reagan tapped into those feelings effortlessly. At his best, Bill Clinton can do it too. Phil Gramm can call this sort of rhetoric empty, but it's the battlefield on which presidencies are won." And I think that was kind of the main shift in it. You shift from this kind of group of pluralists all kind of serving their self-interests to this more of a national sense of a need for shared challenges. And in order to overcome those challenges, the state has to have some level of authority and autonomy to carry out those actions.
What do you think about that, generally speaking, not just you, Kate, but everybody? I mean, does that seem like it makes sense? Understand, and I kind of tried to suggest this without prefiguring the discussion last week when I said, I'm not at all convinced that this article gives any clear reason for why the Skocpols and the Evanses and people like that brought the state back in. But I'm suggesting in that, and I think Caden's tapping into it, there are some things that people started looking at, and more importantly, some reasons why. Okay, why all of a sudden, when it isn't all of a sudden. The argument, by the way, is not nearly as dramatic as it's presented here. This is just, I thought, an interesting way to present it. But what I'm trying to get at is this idea that there are changes. I'll just say it. There are changes in fashion in the social sciences. Okay, it's one of the things that really turned me off of political science in terms of its literature and a lot of its concepts. Is a lot of it is vogue. And I have never been, from the time I was a little kid, really, I've always been suspicious of trends and what's trending and all that. And part of the implication of this article is, well, there's a certain school of thought that everyone kind of clustered around. Caden referred to it as groupthink. And it's clearly the implication is here that there was among pluralists this notion of groupthink. His suggestion, though, is that this had something to do with the Cold War and anti-communism, right? Remember when we were talking about that last week? I want to suggest an alternative to that, and then I want first either Shelby or Caden in particular to respond to that, because this, you've kind of got the best read on this article. I'm going to suggest an alternative version that I think that actually does appear in a lot of Skocpol's work in a certain way. And what it is that we saw people turning away from the concept of the state as it appears in European literature pretty early on, okay? And if you look at the period of the Great Depression and the significant state interventions of the 1930s and the Second World War, not as a trend, but as an aberration, then that explains something that Skocpol acknowledges in her own work, which was one of the things that intrigued state theorists in the first place. I'm trying to step too much on the Skocpol presentation, but one of the things that was interesting about that was, why is the United States so different? Here, because most of the assumptions about theories of the state were that the expansion of things like military industrialism, which is obviously a manifestation of state power, or the expansion of welfare, were either driven by kind of, this notion of the Marxist instrumentalist notion of the state. Well, if it's in the interest of the ruling class, then the ruling class will use the state as its instrument to pursue its interests. But state theorists are saying it just didn't always work that way. Didn't always work that way. And that's why we have social revolutions and things like that. But there's another part of that. If you look in American political experience, this is a commercial republic, okay? We have no history of monarchy. We have no history of an established aristocracy. We have no history of a strong central church. Even if you think about the colonies, there was no single central church that unified all the colonies. They were fragmented. The Articles of Confederation were almost like a treaty signed by potentially warring factions, the colonies, okay? And that's because power was decentralized. The biggest struggle over the ratification of the drafting and the ratification of the United States Constitution was the argument over centralization. Because if you expand a strong central government like Europe, even then, back then it smacked of monarchy. It was the idea of what we're fleeing is an omnipotent central authority that can tell everyone what to do. And that wasn't going to be the nature of the American Republic. And historically, let's be honest, whatever you may think about America, that has not been the case. It's been very hard for the American state acting from a point of central authority to inculcate unifying values or principles or get everybody sort of marching in lockstep, okay? In fact, it isn't the Cold War necessarily, but the realization that the Great Depression and the Second World War were over. And so we almost immediately began dismantling a lot of the social structures that had expanded with the state and the authority of the state during the Depression and the war, right? We went back to a fully privatized industrial system. We didn't maintain state control of that the way much of Europe did after the Second World War in the process of rebuilding. Why? Because we didn't have to. There was no reason for us to do that and every reason for us not to. In other words, does this make sense? Yeah, we had a National Labor Relations Board and we hadn't had that before. But the notion was, it was just a neutral arbiter. It was a referee, okay? You see how that notion of a neutral arbiter, though, really rails against the notion of state autonomy. So that the American experience didn't appear to be an experience of state autonomy. Why would there be an American theory of state autonomy during the period of time that Shipley's talking about? Does it make sense what I'm asking? I don't know if it does.
I mean, the idea is that you because you can escape autonomy, you will. The idea of because Americans have this tradition of trying to escape autonomy, the argument is they don't need the autonomy of the Great Depression. They don't need the autonomy of World War II. And so they go, well, why use it at all? And then try to go as far away from it as possible, at least in rhetoric.
Well, I think in more than rhetoric, particularly, maybe it's time for us to, we're not done with this article necessarily, but I mean, I think that we've got a pretty good idea that the author gives a pretty complex narrative of how paradoxical it is in some ways that the United States rejected central state theory and theories of the state in a way that Europeans had done throughout European history. What I'm trying to suggest is I don't care about the pluralists. They're not my team or anything, but team pluralism would suggest this republic, if you look at its nascent architecture when it's first created, the brand new shiny republic, when the wrappings are just taken off of it, it's all about decentralizing power. It's all about localizing conflict, right? The Madisonian notion, Federalist 10. How do you deal with the fear of factions? You enlarge the republic. And enlarging the republic, you have a multiplicity of arenas for fighting out localized conflicts so that no one of those conflicts will pull the whole architecture down. That's one of the fears of centralization, in addition to the obvious one, which is tyranny. The other part of that is, if you decentralize power, if you fragment or fracture power, even at the national level, if you fracture that into countervailing institutions, the intent there is to make much more difficult the seizure of central control of the entire enterprise. And if you look at the American Republic, as opposed to European systems, that's exactly how it was designed. We didn't have to reject the central state. We'd already done everything we could to build away from that when we put the republic together 2 centuries earlier. Now, again, I'm not asking you to agree with me. I'm not saying this is, I wouldn't have assigned this reading if I didn't think it had value. But the pluralist response to that would be, no, we built a pluralist republic. We didn't want, nor did we feel we needed, nor does history show that we needed a very strong central state as an enduring part of the American political architecture. We don't need it and we don't want it. Americans have always been suspicious of centralized authority. Americans have been always suspicious historically of any large concentration of power. Everybody talks about how, Americans hate big government or conservatives hate big government. Everybody hates big government if there's nothing to push against it and it doesn't serve the interests of the people. But in addition to that, Americans have always been suspicious of large corporations, always. Okay, so any large architecture of power has always been of concern to Americans. That's not the experience of Europe. The experience of Europe is nothing like that. And theoretically, the only antecedents we have, right, are from Europe. So yeah, our scholars went to study with the Germans and here's a strong state and this and that. But what he doesn't mention, it's also, here's Hegel and the theory of civil society. Civil society is where pluralism happens. Right? I'm trying to give a response to that article, because I think this was part of the dilemma that Shelby and Caden were running into, is where does this argument go? Where does it lead? I got the sense that it wasn't that neither one of you did not understand the argument. It seemed like what you were looking for was and. Is that right? Am I misreading?
No, that's mostly right.
I think we did think that it was going to be a lot more straightforward than it was in some parts. And the part in 205 as well, which I was going to bring up, is the whole thing of charismatic rule, which was Weber's view, which is also a part of this, which we thought was important as well.
Okay, can you be more
because it's a
specific?
shift from electoral to charismatic leadership.
Right.
It's at the end of 205. It's pretty much it's mainly based on a ruler that it's pretty much, what it says right here is rule by virtue of devotion to the purely personal charisma of the leader on the part of those who obey him. So the devotion of the people for the political leader is based mostly on personal qualities rather than political positions. So
okay, how does that apply to the United States?
Well, like you were saying, we were going away from the church in the past, and we were wanting something that was less
church. Yeah.
Yeah, we were wanting something that was less centralized. And so, even now, a lot of things with trends and other things like that, and also just we tend to find presidents that know less about political stances and more about just street knowledge, essentially, but not really.
Knowledge?
I don't really know how to explain it.
Well, wait,
It's
well,
like,
let's see if that's
I
accurate.
think
Would you
it's,
say that of Barack Obama, that he had no political
well,
knowledge?
no, I think that it goes back and forth depending
Okay,
on
would you
the,
say that George W. Bush, former governor of Texas, had no political knowledge?
no, I'm not.
Would you
I
say
don't,
that
I
Bill
think-
yeah,
okay,
I did
wait,
say the
wait, wait.
wrong
political
thing.
knowledge?
I am trying to like explain things and then also trying to think of things that I'm not that well
But you
balanced
are
upon.
right in the
So
middle of this argument, though.
yeah,
Shelby, you're right there. You're not wrong. I'm trying to walk you through that to show how there's a kind of irony in all this, in that, you know, we're not supposed to be about rule by a charismatic individual. We're supposed to be about self-rule, the
Mhm.
sovereignty of the people. But you're right. And every survey shows that when people are asked about why they prefer one candidate over another, it can be something as innocuous as their physical appearance, or they seem friendly. Well, George W. Bush, people always used to say, well, I could sit down and have a beer with him. Well, no, you can't, because, you know, unless it's non-alcoholic, he's not going to have a beer with you. But it was that thing of, oh, I could bro down with him. Or we want a president who's more like us.
but could
It
he
be
help
look
keep our
responsible.
country secure? Could he help us in other ways than just have a beer with
Except, you
us
know what?
kind of thing?
I don't think there were a lot of people who were really, when they were voting for Donald Trump, were thinking, is this the best guy to keep the United States secure in the world? This was largely people who didn't know anything about the world and didn't care anything about the world, and really believed this is the radical edge of American isolationism. Well, the world can get along fine without us, but more importantly, we can get along just fine without it. Okay, so it begs the question, Shelby, and again, I am not saying you're wrong. I think you're onto something, but it really begs the question: how important in some place like this, if you're talking about the state, and we're going to in a minute get into Scotch Bowl, but if you're talking about the state and theories of the state, I mean, at some point you do have to ask yourself, well, how important is a charismatic leader to what Scotchbowl calls state capacity? Because Shelby, really, your argument would suggest that Ronald Reagan actually expanded the capacity of the very state he decried publicly because he was charismatic, right? Bill Clinton, to some extent, did the same thing. In other words, because they were largely well-liked in the country, even though their policies were not necessarily well-liked, that expands the capacity of the state. Right? I mean, that's kind of what I think that's kind of what you're saying, is that,
Well, yeah, that's the Weberian view.
well, that's, but yeah, that, not
Right.
only that, but it's,
Yeah.
if it's Weber, it's a charismatic leader backed by lots of guns. Yeah, but that's right. What I'm trying to encourage you to do here as you're going through this literature is to begin thinking about, almost metaphysically, about this concept of the state and the different ways to think about it, that there isn't one way to think about it. Even Scotchball's article and her discussions of the state, she's not arguing, oh, there's only one way to conceptualize the state. Okay. A lot of the anthologies in which she appears that were co-edited, right? There will be other state theorists, but they have different theories of the state. A Marxist is going to have a different theory of the state. You know, Scotchball's not a Marxist. She's informed by Marxism, but she's not a Marxist. She's not even purely a Weberian, as we'll see. All right. Let's see. Let me check my note. Who was going to do Scotchball for us?
Oh, that was me.
I thought it was. Okay. So let me okay.
Sorry that you had to wait so long. We were
No.
thinking about that last time.
I don't think you should worry about it. I
him,
think it's
so.
valuable.
It's okay.
All right. And Kyle doesn't care because I don't allow him to.
I don't know. I mean, the one thing I might care about is now that I've read Bringing the State Back In, I'm gonna like be more focused on that article than the one that I actually was supposed to present on. But you know, it's.
All
I
right.
have
So
notes or
what are
something.
we doing here?
Okay. Well, Scotchbowl starts off with this idea that this difference between European governments and the U.S. of European governments stressing economic development and redistribution and stressing the state, while the U.S. kind of continually makes excuses of why the state isn't actually the actor here. It's some kind of social or cultural or economic force it's playing on. Whereas Europe will say, this is the state's job. The US will say, actually, the influence is made up of a series of cultural, economic, and social actors that inform the state. And so
Can
what
we
she,
stop right there?
Yeah.
Of the theories we've looked at so far, what does that sound like? This comes from these elements of culture and institutions and all this. What does that sound like? Structural functionalism.
yeah, okay, that
Yeah.
was like, yeah, okay.
Just you see though how there this
Yeah.
this is what she's talking about. Okay.
Yeah.
Sorry.
No,
go ahead.
that clicks now in my head. Okay, yeah. And so she kind of looks at that and realizes that these continuous excuses make less and less sense the deeper you get into them. And even when you're reading the other article, the why the state was dropped in the first place, it feels like the pluralists are making more and more and more and more excuses. It kind of like going deeper down like a rabbit hole, and you're like, this makes less and less and less sense as it goes on. And the excuses get worse, and you're like, oh, actually, this is because of this actor, and this because of that actor. And then like, what if that's just the state? And so she kind of returns to the Bavarian view, and basically does research explaining how the state can actually influence people as opposed to people influencing the state. Whereas certain structures of government, or how government is designed, can influence how people act, as one of her main points in the article.
Okay,
And so,
let's be careful about this though, because the Weberian notion of the state takes us in the direction of state autonomy.
okay, yeah.
What you're talking about there, now this is an easy thing to confuse, and it's one of the things I know a lot of you are your minds are gonna bounce off of is, well, what is her theory of the state? Is the state autonomous, or is the state responsive to these interests, the way pluralists say? Her response to that is what she refers to as a Tocquevillian view of the state. And that's that notion that the state has the capacity to exercise a certain influence or frame the discussion in certain ways. And that's part of how the state is able to make sense of the interests that come from the people, from organized interests, okay? That
I
it's
should have gotten the name
responsive,
right, yeah.
but part of its responsiveness is its capacity to mitigate what's called feedback. We'll get into that so far as you want.
Or create feedback, really. But
Well, not so much
kind of a-
create it, but make sure that it's managed.
I guess that makes sense, yeah.
Yeah.
As far as she talks about that. Sorry, I'm just going through my notes. She specifically mentions the idea of policy feedback of existing laws can influence how people shape people's views and informing policies.
That's right, yeah.
Or basically you have a structure of the law is set up here, and so people's views can only oscillate so far, or they're framed around a certain point that is that initial law, which is the state. So the state is putting their reference point there. I don't know how much I should go.
Kyle, how does that relate? Because her original concern was, how do you explain these massive social transformations, these revolutionary transformations of the state?
Oh yeah,
right? And there's something in her theory of the state, and in her attempt to make sense of these large-scale social revolutions, leads her to revisit both the Weberian and the Tocquevillian notions of the state and try to make sense of them. So what happens with the state? What part does the state play in a social revolution, according to her?
Well, the state, I'll go back to mine. I think the idea of this, give me 1 second. Well, the idea is the state has to, or at least in the Weberian notion, the state has to fail, and they have to fail being autonomous, I guess is the best way to if you want to tie it back. The state effectively has to fail the Weberian notion of the coercive use of violence in order to undergo a revolution.
But also remember, when she talks about, this is why she talks about state capacity. It's the capacity to do more than merely oppress your people. The state also lacks the ability to respond to revolutionary demands. It lacks sufficient capacity.
Okay, yeah. I'm trying to get my brain back in But
It's not a simple argument. It's a complex argument.
we're trying to go through other main points I thought were important. Policy feedback. There was also another point deeper in the article, kind of related to the state influencing people of public policies influencing whether citizens actively engage in politics, as in it can influence what people think of decisions, but also it can influence how engaged they are in politics.
And how does it do that?
By structuring the bureaucracy differently, as in the bureaucracy can either more easily or less easily allow people to participate, which will then structure if people participate at all.
Okay, well, for example, I mentioned as a consequence of the Depression and the dislocation of labor, the federal government created the National Labor Relations Board. That's a point of access for labor to air its grievances collectively using the state as a referee. That is, for the first time in American history, as anything other than a coercive apparatus, bringing the state in to mitigate disputes between labor and management. So that's this, you're arguing that she's arguing, that's the state creating a new institutional structure that then determines how interests will interact with the state.
Yeah, and if they will, in some cases.
Or if they will. Or
yeah,
if
because if there's no organization in the first place, the argument could be that people aren't as motivated to do that in the first place. If there's no bureaucratic institution that is set up to deal with that need, then in theory, people might not try to do that, or at least not participate as much as they would have otherwise.
Right. So the idea there with respect to the state is there's a certain degree of state autonomy in that it is ultimately within the bureaucracy of the state itself that these new agencies are actually created and function. You know, part of the state is the legislature, right, that passes the law, that empowers the executive to create the agency. It's executive authority that gives legitimacy and central control, such as it exists, to the agency. But then it's the permanent bureaucracy inhabiting that agency that determines how that agency is going to operate. Those, in other words, none of that happens out there in pluralism land.
Yeah, pluralists don't have a way to basically explain that phenomenon, is the idea. There's basically, I think part of her point is that there's just kind of this series of research that runs effectively counter to pluralism, because if pluralism was accurate, it wouldn't explain these things. It wouldn't explain the state influencing people in these ways, because the state shouldn't really exist, at least in any large capacity in pluralism.
Right. The pluralist argument is that the state was never intended to have the kind of tangible existence that state theorists talk about, that it's just institutions that help, you know, I mean, it is, it's just these institutions that, you know, very neutrally and dispassionately decide who gets what, when, and how. Okay, there's another discussion. This is good. This is good. But any questions so far on what we're doing here? Do you see how her theory of the state, first of all, is different to some extent from structural functionalism? Okay, in other words, she's talking at a grander scale of power because of authority. Okay, it's not just that they're institutions. They're institutions empowered with lawmaking or law enforcing authority. Okay, interest groups are institutions. They can't make law and they can't enforce it. Okay, only the state can do that. And so part of the argument against pluralism and part of the limitation of structural functionalism is it really doesn't distinguish between sort of levels of authoritative power as accurately. If you look at the early schematics that were made about pluralism and early political systems theory, because remember, pluralism is a political system theory. The system is what we're looking at. It's like we're looking at a biological system, you know, the human body. We're not looking at the heart. We're looking at the political system. We're not looking at the brain. We're looking at the system and how it works homeostatically. It's got an automatic tendency to correct deficiencies. No, it doesn't, because most of those early theories, had what was called a black box theory of the state. In other words, they would almost have like a box in the middle of a diagram, and then everything goes in there, and then out of there comes policy with no explanation as to why. Okay, because the meaningful exchanges were among the sovereign people acting as organized interests, just the way the architecture of the Constitution says they should. Okay, so part of this was that the structural functionalists, to some extent, can be said to be, they're not so much guided by the Cold War, they're finding what they expected to find, which was that these institutions are just going to generate outcomes. State theorists say, no, we got to understand who's pulling the levers. Why this decision and not that? When she starts talking about, for example, the development of welfare states, or the willingness or unwillingness of the state to intervene in the economy in any way. Okay, who makes those decisions? How are those decisions made? It's not just, she says, it's not just organized interests in a marketplace of ideas, which is pluralism. How are those decisions made?
Well, they're made with some influence of the organized groups, but ultimately they're made by the state.
Right, because they can only be made by the state. That's that Weberian notion of the state, right? Only the state has the power to do that. You know, in the class I'm teaching on violence, and I'm really having a good time with that one. One of the things that students are in that class are wrestling with a little bit right now is the concept of violence as it applies to the activity of the state. And some theorists would suggest that all lawmaking, we're looking at Walter Benjamin right now, and his argument is that all actions of the state are violence, because even like passing a law is a form of violence. It's a violence to the sovereignty of individuals, okay? And it's also enforced by the coercive apparatus of the state. That's the threat of violence, okay? So I'm not saying that that's exactly what Skocpol's saying, but I'm trying to tie this into the point that Shelby was making earlier, not so much with reference to the charismatic ruler, but to this Weberian notion of the state and the power of the state to have a monopoly of coercive violence, okay? Interest groups must not have that and don't. So they can't make law. And that's kind of where pluralism and structural functionalism fall apart for her, is that they don't explain the outcomes. They explain part of the process. They're not wrong as far as they go. Yeah, there are these institutions, and you know, there are certain considerations, and there's an opportunity for people in the private sector, and there are specifically political institutions and all that, but none of them has authoritative lawmaking and law enforcing power, only the state, okay? So we have to look at the state. The only question then is, how do we look at the state? So part of that, she says, remember, is we have to look at the architecture of the state. Not every state is structured the same. That starts to sound like structural functionalism. Well, they may not be structured the same, but they all have to carry out the same functions. Remember, what are the basic functions of the state? There are three basic functions of government, any government, okay? Regulation, redistribution, and repression. Right? That every state has to have the capacity to do that. So then the question is, how is it done? One of the things that's interesting about Skocpol's argument, and I've never heard any student yet bring this up, but it's really important. When she's talking about the way that the government or the state made decisions about not having national pensions like every other European system was beginning to develop. It's like, well, we'll have a little thing we'll give to veterans of a specific war, the Civil War. Or if the veteran has died, to the widow and family of that veteran. There'll be some small stipend we'll give them. That's not social welfare. That's a specific military benefit. You see the distinction?
Is this
Really
talking about the distinction between like families versus individual workers, or is this something different?
It's partly that. It's partly that.
Okay.
Okay. But also it's the idea that, you know, the American state although at a level of development commensurate with any European state by the middle of the 19th century, certainly by the end of the Civil War, and as an industrial power, we're beginning to dominate. Okay, we're we're as developed as anybody else. Even though we dress funny and we talk funny, but we're really kind of underdeveloped in terms of the capacity of the state, the architecture of the state, sort of, and its capacity to kind of deliver the goods to people. The way, for example, under Bismarck, the German state was the first to come up with anything like a regular national pension. You live to be 65 years old, the state gives you a pension. And it was for working men initially, of course, But the United States didn't do that. Okay, so the question is, why not?
Well, you don't have the same, I guess the argument from Scotch Bowl would be that or probably is, if I remember correctly, is the idea they don't have the same tradition of the state control. And so you lack, or no, oh shoot. It's like a cultural thing too, if I remember correctly.
Well, the discussion, if you're wondering, if you're playing along at home, it sort of starts, I'm trying to think, probably page 115, 116, somewhere in there. The book about protecting soldiers and mothers, right?
Yeah, origin and development of the welfare states.
Why have some old age pension systems been retrenched by conservatives while others proved resistant to such attempts, and blah, blah, blah. So part of it is the transition to the welfare state. Why was the United States, according to Scotch Bowl, why was it so late in committing to anything like the European style welfare state? One of the things she mentions is policy feedback. You mentioned feedback structures.
Oh, political parties.
There you go.
There's feedback. The idea that the government was closely tied to political parties, and that political parties were it was more like, I don't want to say temporary handouts because I feel like that's wrong.
It's not. No, it's a spoils system.
Yeah, I guess it's a good way to put it. Yeah.
So the idea
that way, yeah.
One of the early forms of resistance to the state's capacity to dispense goods and services, the parties wanted to control that because that's the way they controlled getting people to vote. Think about the notion in the United States of the old political machines, right? The Boss Tweed and all the Irish machine in New York City and some of the other political machines that developed. They were almost, if their origins indeed in many cases are gangs. Okay, they developed outside the government, organized and took over parts of the government, and controlled what goods and services could be distributed because they controlled who controlled the government. Okay, in other words, what we had was a relatively weak state. So do you see the implications there for state autonomy? If the political parties can come in from one regime to the next and change fundamentally the direction of the state, to that extent, that state is weak. And the state for most of American history was relatively weak. So it was easy. We didn't have a professionalized civil service. The idea was if you won the election, you decided, who got to be commissioner of this and commissioner of that and sit on this board and all that kind of stuff. Well, ripe for corruption, right? Profiteering, all kinds of things, but not very good at delivering social services. The idea was that's okay. The party will do that. I think for a lot of you, that argument is not sufficiently clear. And if you're not pretty well steeped in the history of political parties in the United States, that part of the argument, is that what's happening? That part of that's just confusing? That she's not making that sufficiently clear? She's talking about limited state capacity there. I feel like I've lost you. You got to let me know if I have, because then I need to back up a little bit and explain it again.
I was just confused how you were talking about how they could take over and control government like an outside group. And then you mentioned it's political parties' jobs at delivering social services. I thought we were talking about political parties.
Political parties are not part of the state. They're private organizations. They always have been.
Yeah.
And if a private organization can use the government to its benefit, that's not a strong state, because it's being manipulated by a private organization. An organized interest is achieving almost, it's a minority controlling what in theory was created to respond to the interests of the majority. She's not, and this is not a critique of Skocpol. She's just assuming a lot of background when she's writing this. But part of what she's talking about, if you look in the abstract, one of the concepts there that might puzzle you a little bit is the idea of what's called state capacity. So state theory requires that we think about the capacity of states to pursue objectives, not only the willingness to do that, state autonomy, but the capacity to do so successfully. If the state can be occupied by an aggregate interest like the Democrats or the Republicans or the Whigs or the Federalists or whoever, and they can take control of that government and turn it in a completely different direction, right? That is a relatively weak state. Okay, it's not autonomous. Do you see that? In other words, if there was resistance to that, the argument you hear now, okay, the election was rigged, all this stuff was a deep state conspiracy. All of that argument, all of that hallucinogenic argument hinges on the notion of a super state hiding within the government, a permanent super state that's completely autonomous, or in this case, obviously dominated by, let's see, Democrats, pedophiles, and somebody else, Satanists, I think. Okay, I mean, I'm telling you, this is what's out there.
The lizard people, dude. It's got to be lizard people.
I mean, capacity of the state become limited when we try to have a democratic state. It can. That's a great question. Yes, it can. This is another part of state capacity that becomes important when we go to the next module's discussion and start talking about the development state. The dilemma of the developing world is weak states. And if you create opportunities for lots of democratic, small d democratic demands on the state, that limits the capacity of the state. Kat, is that what you were asking? That's a great question. And it is the ultimate dilemma of political development. The notion that, well, in order to achieve economic stability and redistribution, we have to stabilize politically. We have to have a state that can mediate the factional disputes between cohorts, organized interests within society, ethnic, religious groups, any kind of, different fractions of the economy, the industrialists as opposed to the agrarians or whoever. The state has to have that capacity to be the rule maker, to be the dispute adjudicator, and to be the law enforcer. Okay, the more democratic that state is, the more potential there is to bleed away state capacity and to weaken the state. That is a great point, and that's one I really want you to lock away. And again, it's one that I'm not sure, again, I have nothing but admiration for Skocpol's work. I'm not sure that's really clear here when she talks about state capacity. Okay, but that's what she's talking about. That's state capacity. It's the dilemma of democracy. The more you democratize, the more you inject into the state new demands. The more new demands the state faces, the more challenged it is to deliver the goods. Imagine if you, I don't know if none of you are old enough to have kids probably, but when you have like a big family, like buddies of mine came from like big families, like 7, 8, 10 kids. The more kids you have, the more demands there are. And those demands come in at least two forms, all right? One of them are sheer material demands. All those kids have got to eat. Okay, all those kids have got to have clothes for school and for going out and doing. Like I remember, my dad used to work in retail clothing and stuff, right? And I guess it was late August, all the moms and dads, usually the moms, would take the kids, this is old school, and they'd go to like the JCPenney's or wherever, and they'd all be buying their school clothes. And you could tell what the capacity of the parents, the state, was by the brands of clothing they bought, you know, and things like that. That's one kind of demand. There are material demands the state's supposed to be determining in terms of the allocation of goods and services, right? But then there's also this demand for attention, for redress of grievance. He hit me, she took my toy, I hate you, you know, all those things that just get magnified to this incredible resonance in large families, right? And it's why it's so hard to raise kids, and why it's especially hard to raise kids when they outnumber you. Because if there are more of them than there are of you, they're going to figure it out. Because kids are insidious. They're like rats, you know, and they just figure it out, you know. I mean, on the great day of the rope, when everything's paved over into a field of glass, there are 3 things that are going to survive: cockroaches, rats, and kids. Because they're tough and they're adaptable. It's amazing. And you all were there, and you all did it to your parents, and so did I. Except I did it quietly and gently, you know. But you see what I'm saying? Now, this is this sort of metaphorical discussion of the dilemma that Katz just posed for us: is what happens when you democratize? Well, what's good about democracy? What's good about that? Just think abstractly. What's good about democracy?
You get to actually hear multiple voices.
Okay, and why? And that's good because
the opinion of one person is not always like super optimal.
Well, not only one person, but even one interest.
Yeah, one interest is not always super optimal.
Right.
And they can be easily nearsighted, and they don't have. Yeah.
Right. So do you see how Scotchbold's saying the state to some extent determines how much capacity it's going to allow by making decisions as to what institutions it will create to allow for more access, even if it's just give us a fair hearing of grievance. You know, like, you know, how free of corruption is the judicial system? How free of corruption is the enforcement mechanism? Right? How accountable to the people? How transparent are the methodologies? You know, are trials going to be held in public or behind closed doors? Those are decisions of the state, okay? But they're important decisions, and that's how this is what Kyle was talking about when he was saying how they influence feedback, okay? If you don't allow for feedback, you don't get any. That was the dilemma of the Soviet Union, okay? The Soviet Union did not have, and I would argue that, you know, post-Soviet Russia right now is struggling with limited attenuated feedback. The state is not listening to the legitimate grievances of its own people. Well, Russia's had a long history of that. Okay, it had 70 years of Soviet socialism, but prior to that, it had the czars. And they weren't listening for the most part. You know, most of those concerns had to be addressed by the aristocracy at the local level. Okay, but if you eliminate that, which Soviet socialism did, at least on paper, how do you get feedback from the people? How do you know how the people are responding to what the state's doing? You don't. So the good thing about democracy, even from the point of view of the state, the feedback loop just involves jail time. Yeah, there you go. Yeah, it's a gulag, man. You know, it's why rule by terror is doomed to fail. Rule by terror is the dramatic, radical limiting of feedback. Okay, not only do you not encourage it, you crush it. Okay, and that won't work. Historically, it's never worked. It's never worked for any length of time. Okay, it's just been a question of, you know, what is the repressive capacity of the state? For example, if the state lacks the ability to regulate, then there's going to be corruption. If it lacks the ability to redistribute, there are going to be lots of disaffected people who need help from the state, and the state can't deliver. This is not meant to be in any way critical of India, but if you look at India right now and the way it's struggling with COVID and this catastrophe of insufficient supplies of oxygen and things like that, that didn't just happen. That's a consequence of actions by the state or inactions by the state as much as anything else. It is not to demonize the state in India, but to say, you know, one of the reasons why we're coping with that and some European countries aren't, decisions or either taken or not taken by the American state, because this thing's been run by the state as much as anything else. Look at Japan. In some ways, a very strong state, and yet, with respect to COVID, it's done terribly. It's done absolutely terribly. And yet, if you look at the cultural variables, Japan has a long history of, social compliance and social obedience and social hierarchy and all these things that you would think, right, would make it the perfect society to deal with something like a pandemic, but it has not done well at all. Okay. Some people are arguing it's the relative weakness of the state. The state's dominated by economic interests, and the economic interests, the big zaibatsus, they just want to open Japan up more and more and more. They don't want to take the economic consequences that America suffered through, that Britain suffered through when you shut things down. Okay, those are actions of the state. Okay, to the extent that they can't be stopped, they're examples of state autonomy. To the extent that the state becomes overburdened, it's often because of the kind of democratic pressures from below that Kat was suggesting. This gets back to Skocpol's notion of social revolutions. Okay, when the normal balance of power, as between, for example, a powerful group of aristocratic landlords situated on the land and some governing authority, when they're more or less in balance, the prospects of successful revolutions are next to nothing. When they become out of balance and one turns on the other or doesn't address the other, that creates opportunities from below. And that's the way she explains the French Revolution. This is what Kyle was talking about early on, when he was talking about the variable, stability of the state and everything and how important that could be. That's how she explains social revolutions. The state can't respond sufficiently to prevent revolutionary forces from rising. Okay. It's a lot to take in, but it's important that we have at least a basic theory of what's meant by the state, because that has, in most of the kind of American civics that you get in high school, for example, in junior high, you don't get that. You don't get any sense that governments can and sometimes must act in a way that is autonomous from the people. Edward Nordlinger, among others. Did I have his name right? Yes, Edward Nordlinger. He was a student of Samuel Huntington. He wrote a book on state autonomy, and he and Huntington both have said at various times that if you want to know what the public interest, look at the interest of public institutions. That's public interest. That's what they're created to respond to. What makes it public is that the state has an architecture to respond to it. The appeal can come from the people, but it's going to remain a private grievance until the state creates an apparatus that can respond to it. Okay. That's the notion of state autonomy, in terms of the formation of institutions and the way the state evolves. Okay. All right. Now, are there other questions about this? There's a lot there, but I just want you to get the flyover view of these things at this point. It's not important that you remember little details. Okay. Anything else on any of these? Okay, then let me give you just a little bit of a preface for next module. By the way, the assignment's up right now. All I want you to do is explain in whatever way you're comfortable explaining how theories of the state emerged as important models in comparative politics. That's about as vague as I could be, okay? I want you to use at least 2 articles in some form or another, okay? Be sure to cite every article every time you use it, even if you don't quote directly. If your thinking is informed by one of the readings, find out where in the reading it is and cite that by the author's name and the page. Okay?
We're not starting the new module till next week, right?
Right.
So, so this week, the groups that talked would probably try to read the new stuff for this next module. But then,
I would say that would be a very, very good idea, since technically we're a week behind, but we're not really. But I wanted to do what I would have done sort of next week. Which I need to do this week, right? Which is give you a little bit of a preview to the next module. Did you have another question, Shelley?
Yeah, I did. You were talking before about how many class discussions we're able to lead and then how many papers we need to write. Could I get a clear number just so that I have it written down?
It's in the syllabus.
Is it? I was looking and I was trying to find if it said it exactly.
Well, then before I say that, let me go back and look at my copy of the syllabus.
Maybe it's because I skimmed it over a second ago.
Okay.
It might have been that.
There's 4 modules. For each module, students in the class will present in class with readings, right? Okay. Let's see. Oh, I see what you mean when you say it does. There's not a clear number of how many.
Hmm.
Yeah. Well, you can do 2 presentations.
Okay, 2 presentations that count as
They will
credit.
count just like they were.
Okay,
Yeah. You can
and then everything
more than
else
2, but 2
are
will
written
count.
assignments. Okay,
Right.
okay,
The reason
Gotcha.
why that's a little different is because normally when I do that, normally, well, do I really want to get into that? No, I don't. Anyway, yeah, you can do 2 for credit. Everything else has to be writing. Until we get, remember, to module 5. In module 5, okay, we're going to do something like in-class debates. Okay. And what we're going to do in the in-class debates is we're going to take up some of these questions of development. I'm going to pose you a question, and then you can decide sort of which side of the argument you want to be on. Okay. And then what we can do is we'll do one week's class. We'll divide you into groups, and you can prepare and strategize on how you want to build your argument. The following week, which would be week 10, you'll actually, I'll pose the question, I'll sort of moderate, and then you'll respond to that. It actually sounds more complicated to explain than it is to do. It's just that there won't be any additional readings or anything like that. I'm doing that deliberately because I want, for the last couple of weeks of class, for you not to have additional readings. What I want you to do instead, by way of preparing for the debate rather than having a final exam, right, is go back and look back at the readings that have been assigned and find out which ones you can apply to your side of the argument. Okay. I'll explain more about that in about week 8. Okay. Most students really like it. The term usually finishes really strong when we do that, because you get away from, first of all, I talk almost not at all, which is always a good thing. But also, one of the things you start to realize is how much you've actually learned that you can put into work. So not anything to worry about. Generally, students find it a lot of fun. For those of you who are not comfortable speaking in front of a class, there are a lot of things that you can do that involve, okay, while someone's speaking or whatever, you can use the chat or whatever to send them suggestions on things to say. You can be Googling something madly while they're, off on a certain argument somewhere. There's always something that people can do who don't want actually to speak in class. That's fine. Okay. Okay. Are there any other questions about that? Because I do want to take just another couple of minutes to talk a little bit about development. But I do also, I don't want to be the Soviet state and cut off all the feedback mechanisms. So if you have questions, please ask. Okay. Should I assume there are no questions? There, see, I got a response. Look at that. All right, very quickly then. Weeks 5 and 6, this is week 5. So technically it's weeks 5 and how much of 6 and maybe even 7 we need, don't worry about it. We got these 3 discussions, and they're getting at this question of development, okay? Now, one of them I put in intentionally because I felt we needed something to bridge from the discussions of the state into discussions of development. But it also begs this question of theories of development. There are a couple of ways we can approach this. One of them is that some people focus on political development, okay? And they say, well, it's sort of that democratic dilemma that Kat was suggesting. Before you can respond to people and know what the economy needs to do, you've got to stabilize things. You have to have durable, resilient institutions, because social forces are going to clash, particularly in emerging societies. That is, where you have maybe a society where they've spent the last 50 or 100 or 150 years or whatever under colonialism, and suddenly they find themselves thrust into the global environment of nation states, and they're expected to be sovereign and solve their problems and everything else, but they've been living under some sort of colonial or imperial oppression for decades or more, right? So their institutions are fragile, and they're new, and they're weak, all right? And so the idea is, how do you develop politically such that doesn't pose the democratic dilemma in an unsupportable way? So do you have a multiplicity of political parties, or do you have a one-party system, or whatever? Whatever the decision is that you make, that's your theory of political development. Okay. Other people say, no, politics follows economics, and not just Marxists. A lot of people say this. Walt Rostow, who was a very significant advisor in the Kennedy administration, wrote a book on development. And Rostow argued in Stages of Economic Growth that once you get any system up to a certain level economically, it hits what's called takeoff point, and it's not going to regress. It's going to keep developing. That is, there's a linear trajectory of transformation identified as development, where you go, for example, from a traditional society to a kind of transitional society to a modern society. And that is that you do away with charismatic authority and you substitute for that, bureaucratic authority. There are a lot of indications of that. You professionalize and bureaucratize. You move away from personal relationships to dispassionate professional relationships. You have more complexity in your society. You have economic diversity. You have a multiplicity of institutions. But the main thing is that you're transitioning from a kind of economic traditionalism, small peasant farmers, rice paddy based economy, whatever, peasants mostly, right? Maybe village elders or something like that, maybe a somewhat larger settlement, but essentially agrarian, traditional, probably theocratic in some way, or at least deeply religious or animistic. You get from that to a modern, sophisticated, complex economy that can deal with a multiplicity of economic demands, where ultimately the aim is not just to survive. You go way beyond subsistence. You get to the point where you're satisfying demand, okay, where you're satisfying lifestyle choice. High mass consumption is the objective. But the main thing with Rostow is that, to simplify a little bit, he seems to imply if you just get the first couple of stages of economic growth right, then it's going to take off. And once that economy takes off, everything's going to sort itself out. It isn't that there aren't going to be, bumps in the road, but if you develop economically, the politics will come together, because the economy will be satisfying a lot of people's needs. That's one theory of it. So the ultimate way to look at this is not to focus on either one, but look at the way they connect. Okay, that's what I want you to do. Some people argue, Samuel Huntington in Political Order and Changing Societies argued that changing societies are changed by economic transformation. Okay, they are. When you experience economic transformation of any type, think industrialization, think the domestication of agriculture and the creation of large settlements. When you do that, you challenge existing institutions every time, because those institutions developed in the environment created by that economic reality. If you're a small nomadic group of people, you don't form a lot of permanent institutions. And the ones that you form are very personalized, because it's a small group of people and you're constantly migrating, okay? You've got a kind of set division of labor, and you can only survive with a certain number of people, and all this other stuff. When you domesticate agriculture, you create new demands. All of a sudden, you got people settled. When people settle, they're going to have bigger families because you can support more people. You're going to have a bigger settlement. You're going to need more food. Okay, you're going to need more water. And then you're going to run into the problem of, like what happens when you pollute the water, and you have a sewage issue. So you need infrastructure. You see where I'm going with this? In other words, you create all this social dislocation because the small migratory band didn't create the kinds of institutions that were meant to survive in a large settled society with increasing complexity, and maybe the use of currency and the keeping of economic records and things like that, all the things that were associated with the development of societies. So what Huntington's arguing is, particularly in the wake of decolonization after the Second World War, all of these societies that had been controlled and dominated imperially by colonizers, now suddenly they're tossed out there and they're saying, okay, go ahead, run before you can walk. Because if you don't, you'll be crushed. Okay, the problem is you've got a lot of people who maybe for the first time They're realizing, hey, we're not colonized anymore. Now I can stop being oppressed, and that means also by this ethnic group or this, this racial group, or we usually they're ethno-religious, right? So you appeal to what exists by way of government and say, okay, you got to respond to me. You gotta, these people want my resources, or these people won't obey the law, or these people won't let me farm here. Whatever these people won't let my people do has to be stopped. But you've got these institutions that are relatively new, relatively fragile. When you have the kind of inevitable institutional collapse that engenders, you develop what's called a Praetorian crisis. Okay. And what happens is the normal mediating institutions, whether it's the church or elders or whatever, who would manage these disputes, they can't handle this. So these social forces that had been mediated in some way in their disputes, they just confront each other directly. And so this is where you have widespread violence and instability, and you can have further revolutions and all kinds of things. Okay. You can't develop economically in a situation like that. You can't, because the very forces of economic transformation are feeding that fire of instability. You've got to develop stabilizing institutions to overcome that Praetorian crisis. And this is why Huntington, paradoxically, even though he was a virulent anti-communist and a very conservative intellectual, advocated in many cases with developing post-colonial systems, one-party states. Now, the model for that is not the United States, which everyone thought, oh, would be like the United States. He's saying, no, they're not ready. They can't be. Give them a one-party state, because they need strong authoritative rule. It's why he also, and others in his school of thought, were not terribly concerned in the short run with military coups and military takeovers and military dictatorships. Because the idea was this concept at that time was the military is a modernizer. In these emerging post-colonial societies, the most modern sector of society is going to be the military, because they've had the most contact, oddly enough, because of the experience of the Second World War, but also because of the Cold War. They've had the most contact with the West and with modern economies, with modern systems of jurisprudence, with modern training, with modern bureaucracy. And so in the short run, it's not the worst thing in the world to have either a one-party state or a strong military state to get you through those dislocations of initial stages of development, okay? So the question that we're going to be thinking about in the next series of things we look at, okay, the notion of a development state, what is it and how does it work and why is it necessary? Theories of dependency and globalization, and this notion of the subsistence is a little bit different, is what's developing, what's changing, what does it mean when something develops? Is any change a development? Are there normative assumptions behind development? Well, you're developing if you're becoming more like the West. That used to be the model. The more like the West you become, the more developed you are. The less like the West you remain, the less developed you are. Okay, does that work? Is that what development is? Because then if it is what development is, does everybody want to develop? Clearly right now, Afghanistan is divided using that model between people who want to be more westernized, who want to, in quotes, develop, and people who want to go back in history 300 to 500 years, which is what the Taliban represents. Okay? We're pulling out, and with us will go the rest of our allies. When we do, don't be surprised if there is either a return to the brutal rule of the Taliban or a pretty violent civil war. That would be what Huntington would call a Praetorian crisis. Oddly enough, it was the American military presence that became the mediating institution, so that now 40% of Afghan women and girls go to school as opposed to 0, and things like that. We were a surrogate for the state in Afghanistan because we were the coercive apparatus of the Barbarian state. Afghan state wasn't strong enough to discipline its own people, to repress them. But with the American military there, we could do it. Okay, when we leave, that state's going to be weak. And every expectation is that it will collapse. Okay, that's a development dilemma. But is it a political development dilemma? Is it an economic development dilemma? Or are we just not explaining and framing the question the right way? That's what I want you to start thinking about. Does that make sense? So when you're looking at these articles, have those kinds of thoughts in your head. Okay, and then you'll get more out of the literature. That's the main thing I'm thinking about. Anything else? All right, then take a look at those readings, and we'll probably take them in order with grand strategy and the development state, and then we'll go from there. All right? Nothing else? All right, then I'll see you next week.
Have a good one.
You too.
Bye.
Thank you.